NATO is already in name only. Does the EU have the capability to fill the void left by the US withdrawal? In the 3 years since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, the United States has provided approximately $116 billion in aid to Ukraine, while EU countries have collectively contributed €134 billion, about $145 billion. These figures indicate that European nations are not only capable of assuming their own defense responsibilities but have even surpassed the US in financial contributions. Yesterday, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced that the EU plans to allocate €800 billion, approximately $880 billion, to rearm Europe. This massive sum is approaching the annual US defense budget, which clearly proves that the EU has the economic strength to fill the military gap left by a US withdrawal. This suggests that Europe can fully replace the US in terms of financial support and independently safeguard its own security. However, the biggest shortcoming of European military power today is not funding but the fragmentation of its defense systems and the lack of a unified command structure. The EU must face reality and accelerate military integration to establish a unified defense system. Otherwise, even with ample funds, effective security guarantees will remain elusive. Trump's unreliability has rendered NATO practically defunct, leaving Europe's security in jeopardy. NATO was founded in 1949, explicitly establishing the protection of member states' democratic freedoms as its core value while setting up a collective defense mechanism. However, U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly demonstrated indifference toward democratic values, openly calling NATO obsolete and even threatening multiple times to withdraw from the alliance. In recent years, most NATO member states have met the 2% of GDP defense spending target, a long-standing U.S. demand. However, just last month, Trump called for Europe to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP and hinted at potential further hikes to 8% or beyond. Clearly, his goal is not merely to push Europe to contribute more but to create tensions as a pretext for the U.S. to exit NATO. I used to support Trump, initially believing that he simply wanted the EU to shoulder a fair share of NATO's expenses. However, I have recently come to realize that his agenda has strayed far from a reasonable financial burden-sharing approach based on the defense of democratic values. Instead, he appears to show an inexplicable favoritism toward authoritarian regimes. Trump's actions are not isolated decisions but stem from his long-held ideological affinity for dictators. During his presidency, he repeatedly praised Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un, seeking closer ties with them. His foreign policy has deviated entirely from NATO's founding values, effectively rendering NATO a hollow shell. In light of this, the EU must abandon any illusions and take charge of its own security by building a new European defense system. The major challenges facing European military integration. The integration of European military forces faces the following key obstacles. Differences in language and organizational structures. European countries have diverse military systems, chains of command, and operational doctrines, making cross-border coordination extremely complex. Lack of equipment standardization. EU nations operate a chaotic mix of military hardware. For instance, they use 17 different models of main battle tanks, leading to costly logistical and maintenance challenges. Diverging national defense policies. Different countries prioritize various aspects of defense spending, military industries, and combat strategies, making a unified military strategy difficult to achieve. The best solution: a unified European army. The EU's 1.47 million troops are scattered across 28 countries, with different languages, training systems, and weapon standards. For example, the 17 different models of main battle tanks significantly hinder battlefield logistics and operational coordination. The solution is straightforward: establish an independent, unified European army that operates separately from national forces. Each country could contribute 100,000 to 200,000 troops to form a joint force dedicated solely to EU defense, without involvement in domestic affairs. Standardization of weapons and equipment. Ammunition, tanks, fighter jets, and artillery should be standardized or made interchangeable to lower production and procurement costs while increasing operational efficiency. Enhanced joint training and combat readiness. Regular large-scale military exercises should be conducted to improve interoperability, ensuring rapid response to future conflicts. A unified command structure. A single command center should be established to ensure quick responses to border threats without bureaucratic delays from national governments. The ultimate goal of this reform is to provide the EU with a truly autonomous and controllable defense force, eliminating reliance on U.S. military protection. Establishing a European nuclear deterrent. Beyond conventional forces, Europe must develop its own nuclear deterrent to prevent Russian military provocations. Currently, the EU's nuclear capability relies primarily on France, but this is insufficient. A concrete plan should include French nuclear forces in Germany. As the only EU country with nuclear weapons, France should deploy part of its nuclear arsenal in Germany to provide Central Europe with an effective second strike capability. This would strengthen Europe's deterrence and strategic autonomy. Germany's independent nuclear program. To ensure long-term security, Germany should be permitted to develop and deploy its own nuclear weapons. With its advanced industry and technology, Germany could establish a fully operational nuclear arsenal within a decade, significantly boosting European deterrence. A unified European nuclear command. France, Germany, and potentially other nations, e.g., Poland, should establish a joint nuclear command system to ensure rapid response capability in crisis situations, preventing further Russian aggression in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. Restoring Germany's military leadership to contain Russia. If the EU fails to reach a consensus on military integration and nuclear strategy, an alternative approach would be to restore Germany's pre-World War II military strength and allow it to assume leadership of European defense. Currently, Germany's armed forces are relatively small, with only 182,000 active personnel. However, if restored to its World War II scale, over 4 million troops, Germany could significantly enhance Europe's military capabilities. Under this framework, Germany would assume a leading military role in Europe, not by repeating the mistakes of WWII's multi-front warfare but by focusing solely on Eastern defense to counter Russian expansionism. Germany's advanced industrial base and military technology, e.g., Leopard 2 tanks, Eurofighter Typhoon jets, would allow for a rapid military buildup. Additionally, Germany should be permitted to develop its own nuclear weapons to establish an independent nuclear deterrent. Long-term goal: a unified European nuclear program. The EU must eventually develop a collective nuclear deterrent independent of the US to prevent Russian aggression. Russia's ability to pressure Eastern Europe militarily stems from Europe's lack of an independent nuclear deterrent and over-reliance on the US nuclear umbrella. If the EU builds its own nuclear arsenal, Russia will be forced to reconsider its expansionist policies. Conclusion: NATO is already functionally obsolete, and it is meaningless for the EU to pretend otherwise. Given the reality that the US could exit NATO at any time, Europe's only viable option is to create its own independent defense bloc. Financially, the EU is fully capable of funding its own defense, as evidenced by von der Leyen's €800 billion military investment plan. Structurally, the EU must integrate its 1.47 million troops into a unified European army. Without a centralized command structure and standardized equipment, even well-funded forces would remain disorganized. Nuclear deterrence: France's nuclear forces should be stationed in Germany, and Germany should develop its own nuclear arsenal to counter the Russian threat. If the EU continues relying on American protection, it will ultimately become a pawn in Trump's strategic calculations, forced to accept decisions dictated by US and Russian interests. Only by achieving true independence and creating its own defense system can Europe establish itself as a global power and break free from reliance on the US.